Okay, good morning, everybody. Share the screen. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so yesterday what we were learning is about terms of leasing. And remember, there is a distinction between real estate and chattel right now. We're just dealing with chattel. If the last thing we learned yesterday in Likutim is that lechatchila, it's prohibited to lend out something that you've borrowed. You can't lend it out to a third party. B'di'evet, if you do that, you are not a gazlan, you're not an evil person, but at the same time, your friend does have a right to have recriminations against you. There is another opinion that you are a gazlan. So we saw two different opinions, and one of the ramifications being, could you be yotze a sukkah where someone lends you a beam that doesn't belong to them, but that they borrowed from somebody else. Okay. All right. Now, and the reason why that was given by the Rav Shulchan Aruch is she'eino neman be'eineihem. The language was just because Yankel trusted Reuven with his prized, object, with his prized widget, doesn't mean that he trusts Shimon with that same prized object. And like we said, Kishema ein ritzonu sheyehi pikdonam biyad acher she'eno neman be'eineihem kazeh. Even maybe the Shimon is not as trustworthy in the eyes of the owner as Reuven is, and we had said that that's true, even if Shimon's standing within society is of a much higher station, and Reuven is sort of like a schlepper. But Yankel could still say, I trust Reuven more than I trust Shimon. So in the Likutim, he says, V'yesh lihistapek im hoda bifnei beistin shegam hu haya ma'amin lahasheni im ze mahani lepotro kimo biragil lahafkid etzlo. He says, what would happen if there was testimony that actually had been heard even in a Beis Din, that Yankel had said, oh, I trust Shimon as much as I trust Reuven. Would that be sufficient? In other words, is it only sufficient if a pattern had already been established, where Yankel had already in the past lent items to Shimon? There we say that it's okay for Reuven to lend it to Shimon. What if we had just heard him testify that? It's not really clear. And the reason why it's not clear is because a lot of times people will say things in order to gain some kind of equity in a relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they would act upon it. So even if someone overheard Yankel saying, oh, I would trust Shimon as much as I would trust Reuven with my possessions, it's not necessarily the case. You can't necessarily, certainly if it wasn't said in a Beis Din, you wouldn't be allowed to take that information and say, oh, I heard Shimon comes over to Reuven and says, can I borrow that book that Yankel gave you? And Reuven said, well, when I'm done with it, I have to give it back to Yankel, but I'm sure you could ask him. So he says, what's the big deal? You're almost done, and Yankel is out of town, so why not just let me have it? So Reuven says, well, the halacha is that I have to actually give it back to the owner. I'm not allowed to lend out something that was lent to me. Then all of a sudden, Levi chimes in, and Levi says, I heard Yankel say that he would have no problem at all lending it to Shimon. You always love those third-party people who decide to make everything their own business, right? So Reuven would have to turn to him and say, I respect that, Levi, but that doesn't change the fact that I don't have that authorization. And until I know for myself that it would be okay with Yankel. I simply can't do it. If you want, we can get him on the phone. Oh, it's Yantiv today, right? So there are clearly scenarios where you might feel pressured to do something like that, but the halacha is clear. Okay. And then we said, if, however, there has already been a record or a pattern established, so then it's okay. But we have to go back and do some more Imrei Yaakov, okay? So we said that you're not allowed to lend it to a third party, but you are allowed to lend it to your wife and children because that's assumed that you're going to that you're going to do that. You're not allowed to even lease it to somebody else, even if your intention is to give the money to the owner. And this is true even with Holy Scripture, afilu sfarim. And he says, and the reason is, he says in Imrei Yaakov Daled, he says, Da'af shera'inu, sha'asa habalabayis chesed b'mamono v'hishol sifra l'lmod bo lazeh. He says, because the argument being, you would think that a person who owns a sefer has demonstrated that he wishes to do chesed with others and give them the opportunity to learn from his svarim, which is, by the way, a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to lend out your svarim so that other people can learn from them. So it would be reasonable to assume that just like he wants to do a chesed with Ruvain, he would want to do the same chesed with Shimon. But that still does not give Ruvain license to lend out the sefer that Yankel had lent him. Because it is possible that Yankel does not want that sefer to get into Shimon's hands. I can tell you for a fact that after years of having lent out Sfarim and not getting them back, that I don't regularly make a practice of it, or I certainly don't advertise that my Sfarim are available for loan. But if there's someone who I feel very close with and I really trust immaculately that this person will get me back the sefer, then I will lend out. I'm sure there's over a dozen Sfarim that I've lent out that I've never gotten back, right? And it's possible that I've borrowed stuff that I haven't returned. I don't even know. I'm not aware of any, but it's possible. And people tend to overlook things, right? We all know this. As a matter of fact, there are times when someone will bring a sefer up to me at the bima and say, "Here, Rabbi, I want you to read this sefer because it's gonna blow you away, and give it back to me whenever you like." So I try to decline. I really do, and it's a very uncomfortable situation for me to be in because I don't like borrowing things from other people because I'm scared that I'm going to forget, especially because I have a lot of my own svarim that are on my to-do list to read. And as much as you may have enjoyed that particular sefer that you're reading, if you'd like to recommend it to me, that's great. If you want to give me a book, that's also great. I can't guarantee I'm going to get to it right away, but I'd prefer if you don't lend me a sefer because it becomes a burden. It really becomes like, oh no, I have to now keep track of where this book is. I have to, so it's, the truth is that you can't assume that just because Yankel lent the sefer to Ruvain, he's happy for it to be lent out to Shimon. That's the point. Okay.
Rabbi, if you borrow something and don't return it, is that considered theft then? Does that convert to theft?
It is a form of theft, sure. It's a form of theft. It may be unintentional theft because you've just forgot about it, but it is a form of theft. What were you going to say, Ron? The same thing? Okay. That's correct. That's actually brought in the Mishnah Berurah. Yeah. Right. What Errol is saying is that there's a halacha in Orach Chaim that says that if someone's talis and tefillin was left in shul, you are allowed to assume that the person would be happy for someone else to use it. And that's true in general. Some have argued that it may not apply as readily in today's world where people are very hung up on hygiene and germs and things like that, especially maybe in the midst of COVID, that probably would not have applied. But as a general rule, that is true. If you haven't put on tefillin and you find someone's tefillin in the Beis Medrash, you don't have to ask questions. You can assume that that person would be happy for you to put it on, and you're allowed to borrow it. But you do have to put it back in the exact same place where you found it, in the same condition. Wrap it the same way, and do the best that you can. Okay.
Rabbi, did you say that Ron Becker was there?
I did say that Ron Becker was there.
I just want to proclaim to everyone that Why Do I Need to Learn Gemara is Ron's book. I'm sorry for not returning it, Ron. And
Ron, you're going to have to.
Next time I come, I hope I remember to bring it back.
You know what? It would be even better if Ron would fly to Israel and spend time with you there. And then
I tried to tell him that. I tried to tell him, Rabbi.
Okay, great. So the only thing we got out of the shir today was that Ron now knows where his book is. Dayenu, right? You had forgotten about it, Ron, right? So perfect example of where, and it's everyone's well-intentioned, you love each other, right? But it just happens, we lend people books, people forget, we all have tons of books. And sometimes it can, stuff can be a burden, and that's why a lot of people, even though they're happy to perhaps lend a sefer to someone who they know and trust, because like even in this case, Wayne probably is so well known to Ron that no matter where they are in the world, they'll be able to connect. But what if it had been another person that wasn't as close to Ron, and the guy makes aliyah, Ron's book is gone forever, right? So anyway. So Ron, does Wayne have permission to, you'll have to. Yeah, right, okay. All right, let's go on. Okay, so biyad acher, because maybe he doesn't want, maybe Yankel doesn't want his sefer to be in someone else's possession. B'davka im hu motzio mi beiso u'reshuso, avol b'beiso rashai lahashilo k'del kamen sifdalid. So another qualification is that when Ruvain has borrowed a sefer and it's in his house, Shimon comes over to his house as a house guest. Okay, they come over for lunch on Shabbos, and he sees Ruvain with this new sefer on his mantelpiece, so like a new book by Rabbi Sachs, or some other really like amazing new sefer, and Shimon says, "Well, I haven't seen this before. May I?" And Ruvain can say, "Sure, take a look at it. As long as you stay within my house, you have perfect permission." That's what this halach is saying. You don't have to guard the sefer from other people's hands as long as it remains within your property, right? So you are allowed to let other people read the book as long as it doesn't leave the house. And that's really what we know that Yankel cares about. He wants to make sure that it remains in Ruvain's possession. And she'eno neman beinehem, because maybe other people are not as trustworthy. Afilu imhu shomer chinam v'rotze limsu l'shomer sachar. So this is true, even if Ruvain would like to upgrade the level of, I guess, the second borrower, right? So he says as follows: a person who's a shomer chinam, like he gives it over to Ruvain, and he says, "Do me a favor, I'm going out of town, watch this for me." And Ruvain now needs to go out of town also, so he wants to give it to Shimon, and he wants to pay Shimon. And by paying Shimon, he upgrades the level of responsibility. Because remember, a shomer chinam is only liable for what? For negligence. An unpaid watcher is only liable for negligence. And here we're talking about a case not where Yankel is lending something to Reuven, but he's asked Reuven to watch it for him. So Reuven is doing him a favor, not the other way around. In that case, but he's not liable for theft or loss. Reuven now wants to go ahead and hire someone to watch Yankel's item. So he turns to Shimon and says, I'll pay you $10 if you watch this for me while I'm gone for the day. That's not permitted either, even though you would think that I'm upgrading the level of responsibility on this object. And why is that? Because Yankel could always turn around to Reuven and say, no. I didn't agree to that because I trust you, Reuven, that if something were to happen to my object, you would own up to it. I don't know that guy, Shimon. He may have a higher level of responsibility on his guardianship because he's being paid for it, but I don't know if I can trust the guy. What happens if something, right? So fine, you're paying him, so he's liable for theft or loss now. But what happens if he claims that armed burglars came in, where it's an onus? Onus is a greater level of force, of coercion, where even a shomer sacher is not liable, right? So he says, what if Shimon were to swear that in court? I have no recourse against him, and I don't know that I trust him. Maybe the guy's a lawyer. So therefore, Yankel's, even in that situation where Reuven wants to upgrade the level of liability of the watcher, he cannot take liberties without checking with Yankel first. Mm-hmm. It's not a loan, it's a watching, right? Ve'enaf gemina ben kelim sheyesh bahem pchas b'hishtamshusam uvein im ein bahem pchas. And furthermore, there's no distinction in halacha between whether the item depreciates through wear and tear after each use or not. In other words, you could have very durable items where Reuven could say to himself, well, what difference does it make if Shimon holds on to this? It's so durable, this item, that it's not going to wear down by another pair of hands, using it. It's the amount of depreciation would be negligible. Sometimes one could argue that a paperback book, every time someone reads it, the spine starts to wear down, right? Someone could argue with a garment of clothing that every time you wear it, it starts to wear down. But there are other potential items. Say a chair. There's very little wear and tear on a super durable, heavy chair. So Reuven could say, what difference does it make? Or the case of the beams of the sukkah, for the 2x4s for the sukkah. What kind of wear and tear is there on lumber? Just if he wants to use it to support his schach. Can't imagine that anyone would care about that. He says it doesn't make a difference. Shaharei hatamhu she'ein ritzonu she'yakelev u'metaltel biyad acher she'einu ne'eman be'einav. Because the reason is not the concern over wear and tear. The concern is that Yankel may not trust Shimon to be responsible with his item. And that's the reason why it's not permitted for Reuven to lend it or to ask Shimon to watch it instead. And this is true, says the next Imrei Yaakov, even if Shimon is adir she ba'adirim, even if his standing in society is of a much higher station than Reuven's, it doesn't matter. Afilu im yadua lakol sha'ashenu tov v'kosher me'harishon. Even if everyone knows that Shimon is a much more trustworthy person than Reuven is. You never know. Yankel may have his reasons for only wanting Reuven to have it and not for Shimon to have it. So therefore, it's not permitted lahavir al ritzon ba'olim. You're not allowed to violate the wishes of the owner. Ba'afilu im bedaito lekabel alav kol hachrayas. He says, and that's true even if Shimon accepts 100% liability without any exception whatsoever, right? Afilu im yamus machmas melacha ein ze klum. Even if Shimon says, I accept all liability, even something that a shoel, a borrower, would not be liable for. Because we know that a borrower has the highest level of liability. What is a borrower liable for? Negligence for sure, theft and loss, yes, and also onus. Even if lightning strikes, with it, and it's an act of God, a shoel is still responsible. There's only one thing that a shoel is exempt from: if the object dies in the course of its use. So, for example, it's what's called meita machmas malacha. It dies in the course of work. If I borrow a donkey, which is a beast of burden, and I borrow it to schlep, and all of a sudden the animal just groans and drops dead, so even a shoel is not liable for that. It would have to be demonstrated that I worked it too hard. But if it was a standard, if the witnesses testify that this is a standard, let's say 50-pound load, every donkey is capable of that. This donkey had schlepped it all the time. So then that's an act of God that even goes above the liability of a shoel. Okay? In modern examples, if let's say I borrow your car and all of a sudden the car just conks out on the side of the road. So as long as I was just driving it normally, then I'm also not going to be liable for that kind of thing. Now, I still might be liable if in the course of driving it, I got into an accident, that I would be liable for. But I wouldn't be liable for something that had nothing to do with my driving, and it just conked out.
I guess the idea, Rabbi, is it would have happened even if it was in the owner's possession.
That's right. That's right. So Reuven has Yankel's donkey, and Shimon wants to borrow it. And Reuven says, I'm sorry, it's not mine. I can't lend it to you. And Shimon says, well, I'll accept all liability. Even the liability that a shoel would not be liable for, such that even if the donkey dies while in the normal course of its work, I will assume full liability. Even that, Reuven does not have a right to lend it out to Shimon because it's a question of trust, and it's not mine, and I can't do it. So that doesn't count either. Okay. So this whole issue of Mesa Machamas Malacha is really the subject of this biurim. He writes, the biurim quotes the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Mem Sif Aleph, de Mesa Machmas Malacha Pater, that if the animal dies in the normal course of labor, the shoel is going to be exempt. V'hu shelo yishaneh lasos bo davar acher chutz mehamalacha asher sho'ala bishvila. And that's provided, as Ron had said, that you don't change the animal's normal course of work. And if the donkey is meant for schlepping, you use it for schlepping. Let's say you decide, I want to use this donkey for plowing, right? And the donkey is not used to pulling a plow. It's used to just carrying loads from Minsk to Pinsk. So then you would be liable if the animal were to drop dead in the course of plowing, even if you swear up and down, but it's no more wear and tear on the animal than if it's schlepping something on its back. It's a different form of muscle use, and therefore you have to assume liability. Shimshina va'asaba malacha acheres chutz mehamalacha sheshala bishvila afilu hikala mimenu talinan demachmas osa malacha sheshina mesa. And the Shulchan Aruch says, we assume that it died because of the change that you made, even if the change that you made was a lighter, less corrosive exercise on the animal than what the animal is normally used. So, for example, I want to borrow your car. So, and I tell you, I want to borrow your car because I need to do carpool today, and my car's in the shop. Do you mind lending me your car? And you say, sure, not a problem. In the meantime, you take, in the meantime, I take your car, and instead of just driving it to use carpool, what do? I decide, you know what, I don't need the car after all, but well, or yeah, I either do that. I'm just trying to think of another example of where the car is being used in a different way. There, the car, you might argue, is arguably not being used at all. But let's say I decide to drive the car up a slope, right? And it's not the normal use. And all of a sudden, the whole suspension system in the car collapses, right? So you could say that's not normal, right? Just because I drove up a steeper incline than I would normally drive, that the whole suspension should break. You're right, it's not normal. But I didn't, Yankel didn't lend me the car for that purpose to drive it up a steep incline. So even though it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen, and therefore I'm going to be liable. Okay. So we'll continue this discussion in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Take care.